I'm Reverend Ron, Enlightened Spiritual Master and student of A Course in Miracles. This video of May 9th, Saturday 2020 is under the direction of the Holy Spirit. For those who disagree with what we say, I accept full responsibility. For those who agree, I take none of the credit. All credit to the Holy Spirit. With that, let's get started. Now, first we have to see what the difference between the Holy Spirit and the ego is and what the difference between their voices are. When the Holy Spirit speaks to someone, he speaks in a soft, reasonable voice, and it's God's decision and God's will, and he speaks to us of God's will. When the ego speaks to us, he shouts in a thunderous voice and demands. He demands that we have wars, that we have material wealth we don't need, that we accumulate things far in excess of what we need. And the ego just demands. And that's just about the big difference between the two of them. And the Holy Spirit requests that we do things, that we do God's will in a reasonable, calm, rational voice. The ego demands that we accumulate things that we don't need and that harms everybody else. So that's the big difference between the two voices that we have the options of listening to. Now, the first example I'm going to give you here of ego versus Holy Spirit is dating all the way back to the Civil War. It's the example of slavery and the Civil War as it happened in our country. Now, the first thing is slavery should not have happened. We should have brought those people here as free people and paid them a reasonable wage and reasonable accommodations and treated them well in return for their labor. And none of this would have ever needed to happen. But it did happen. We had the institution of slavery with all its evils and everything that was wrong with it. And this institution was pretty well entrenched. So we decided, the ego decided, it spoke to the people involved and decided we had to have a civil war to eliminate this slavery. Now, we didn't need a civil war to eliminate slavery. Slavery was on its way out when this happened. We had the Underground Railroads. The slaves were being freed anyway. They were slowly being educated, and slavery would have died out on its own eventually. But instead, we have the Civil War. 500,000 people died, and we had North versus South for untold years after that. And we had about 150 years of institutionalized brutality against the black people after that. We had segregation, we had Jim Crow laws, we had the Ku Klux Klan, we had the Night Riders, we had lynchings, we had all sorts of other things that happened. And by the way, it still happened. I mean, just recently, as anybody knows, there was a young black man shot in the Deep South by two people for whatever reason. Now, they're only accused of this right now. They haven't had a trial yet, so I can't go on camera and say they're guilty. They have to receive a trial. But here's the thing, they were shot in February, and the local district attorney was going to convene a grand jury, except there weren't any grand juries being convened because of the coronavirus thing. So this thing was not going to be prosecuted, and it was going to go away. And the only reason it's still here, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation took over and made 2 arrests in this case. So in that sense, this is still happening even today. And these are leftover things from the Civil War era. We're still fighting that battle, and it's all because the ego who caused us to commit the first sin of bringing people here as slaves, and the second one of fighting the Civil War. Now, the next example I'm going to use here is a more modern example. This book by Chris Hedges and Joe Seco, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. It was written in 2012, so I assume the things they've written about haven't changed much, if any, since then. They wrote 5 chapters in here, and the first chapter is Days of Theft, and it's about the conditions on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. Now, as anyone who has any knowledge of history knows, the Indians are a separate issue. We treated them horribly. We exterminated them. We killed their food supply, which is the buffalo. We herded them onto reservations. Many of them died on the Trail of Tears. It was just a complete, total, ruthless extermination made possible by people listening to the voice of the ego, because the ego says, the only Indians I ever saw that were good were dead, and that was later changed to the quaint old saying, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. So that's an example of what the ego will tell you. The next chapter is Days of Siege in Camden, New Jersey. Now, Camden, New Jersey is just one of our inner cities that is totally, completely uninhabitable. And it's made that way because we listen to the voice of the ego, and there's not a worldwide sharing of the material wealth of the world, and the people aren't treated fairly, and they aren't given adequate resources and education to improve their lot in life. And that's why we have inner cities like Camden, New Jersey, and just about all of our major cities. The next one, chapter 3, is Days of Devastation. It's about Welch, West Virginia, where they mine the coal. And they've totally destroyed the land there, totally, absolutely destroyed it. Great mounds of fumes of coal dust rise into the air. You can't breathe the air there. The people there die of lung cancer and other diseases, emphysema and things like that, at a much higher rate than the rest of the country. The schools there have inhalers, so the children, most of whom have asthma, can take a hit off these inhalers when they need to do something for their asthma. Days of Slavery in Immokalee, Florida. That's where they grow the strawberries in the fields there, and it's illegal immigrants that work in these, so nobody cares about them. And they spray these strawberries with unbelievably toxic chemicals that kill every form of life that might even eat a little bit of them. They cover the fields with plastic to keep the fumes of these chemicals in, to further kill everything and make it even more toxic. When the workers lift this plastic to pick the strawberries, the fumes off these chemicals just about kill them. And then they send this produce to market where we buy it and consume it, and who knows what any of those toxic chemicals are doing to our bodies. So that's another example of the ego at work. And the last chapter here he wrote is Days of Revolt, which is what happened in Liberty Square in New York City when it was an Occupy against Wall Street movement. So this book here is well worth a read, and as you read through this book, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about and see the ego at work here, which the result of all this, and the ego has us buy things we don't need and do things we don't need to do. And it speaks to us in a loud voice that commands, commands, commands. So what we need to do is we start listening to the voice of the Holy Spirit, which will speak to us more reasonably and of doing God's will, which will lead to a better world. In closing, thank you much for watching this, and we'll see you in the next video.